A Kingdom's Long Road. London, 1918. Victoria Bennet heard murmurs in an empty cemetery at twilight as the wind carried the whispered confession, "I never truly left," echoing from the tomb of Private Albert Shaw. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Gloaming. The wrought iron gates of Abney Park Cemetery creaked shut behind Victoria, their mournful groans swallowed by the descending twilight. London, October 1918. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, clung to her like a shroud. She pulled her worn wool coat tighter, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that seeped deeper than her bones, a chill that had taken root months ago, when the telegram arrived. "Regret to inform you Private Albert Shaw killed in action." The words, stark and brutal, had shattered the fragile peace she'd cultivated, a peace built on whispered promises and stolen moments. Victoria paused before his grave, the granite cold and unforgiving beneath her gloved hand. The inscription, freshly carved, seemed to mock her with its finality. Private Albert Shaw.
Brevet de sang.
Faithful soldier. Beloved. Yes, he had been that. Faithful? That was a question that clawed at her, a relentless beast she couldn't tame. She knelt, the damp seeping through her stockings, and traced the letters of his name. Albert. The name that had once been a song on her lips was now a dirge in her heart. The wind picked up, rustling the skeletal branches of the ancient yew trees that guarded the cemetery. It swirled around her, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys, a ghostly reminder of the cozy evenings they'd spent before the war, before the world had gone mad. Evenings filled with shared dreams, whispered hopes, a future that now lay buried beneath the cold, hard earth. She hadn't intended to come today. The anniversary of his death, officially recorded, was still a week away. But the restlessness had become unbearable, a constant thrumming beneath her skin, driving her from her small, empty flat in Bloomsbury to this place of sorrow. She tried to find solace in her work at the hospital, tending to the endless stream of wounded soldiers returning from the front, their bodies and minds shattered by the horrors they'd endured. But even the cries of the injured, the metallic tang of blood, couldn't drown out the whispers in her own heart. The whispers had started subtly, a fleeting sense of unease, a prickling on the back of her neck. Then, they'd grown bolder, coalescing into a voice, faint but unmistakable, on the edges of her awareness. A voice that sounded chillingly like Albert's. At first, she dismissed it as grief, the mind playing tricks in its desperate attempt to hold on to what was lost. But the whispers persisted, growing stronger, more insistent, until she could no longer ignore them. She closed her eyes, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. The air grew colder, a localized pocket of frigid air that settled directly over Albert's grave. And then she heard it, clear as a bell, yet soft as a lover's sigh, carried on the wind, a whispered confession that froze her blood. "I never truly left." Victoria gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked around wildly, but the cemetery remained deserted. The only movement was the swaying of the branches, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the distant rumble of a motor car on the Stoke-Newington road. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Had she imagined it? Was it simply the wind, playing tricks on her grief-stricken mind? She pressed her hand to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to believe it was a delusion, a phantom born of sorrow. But deep down, a sliver of something else, something akin to hope, flickered within her. A hope as dangerous as it was alluring. She stood up, her legs trembling. She looked at the grave again, the cold, hard stone a stark contrast to the warmth of the whispered words. "Albert?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Albert, is that you?" Silence. Only the wind answered her, whistling through the tombstones, a mournful symphony of the dead. But the feeling remained, the unsettling certainty that she was not alone, that something or someone was watching her. Victoria backed away from the grave, her eyes fixed on the dark, silent earth. She turned and fled, stumbling through the gathering darkness, the iron gates clanging shut behind her like the closing of a prison door. She didn't stop running until she reached the bustling street, the gaslights casting long, flickering shadows that danced around her like mocking spirits. She hailed a passing cab, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fumble for the coins. As the cab rattled away, she looked back at the cemetery, its dark silhouette looming against the twilight sky. The whispers seemed to follow her, echoing in the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves, a constant reminder of the confession she'd heard, the secret that had been unearthed from the grave. Back in her flat, she lit the gas lamp, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. She poured herself a glass of sherry, her hand still trembling. She needed to think, to make sense of what had happened. Was it grief? Madness? Or something far more unbelievable? She sat down by the window, staring out at the darkened city. The war had changed everything. It had taken Albert, her future, her sense of security. It had also, it seemed, blurred the lines between the living and the dead. A shiver ran down her spine. She took a large sip of sherry. The confession I never truly left. If it wasn't a delusion, what did it mean? And what was she supposed to do about it? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a chilling prelude to the secrets that were yet to be revealed. The feeling of being watched, though less intense than in the cemetery, lingered. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that tonight was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Unsent Letter. The morning light, weak and filtered through the grimy London smog, did little to dispel the unease that had settled over Victoria during the night. Sleep had been a fitful, restless affair, punctuated by fragmented dreams of whispering winds and shadowed figures. She rose, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. She made herself a cup of weak tea, the meager rations barely enough to sustain her, let alone provide comfort. The war had brought scarcity to every corner of London, a constant reminder of the sacrifices being made, the lives being lost. As she sipped the lukewarm tea, her gaze fell upon the small, wooden box that sat on her mantelpiece. It was Albert's box, containing the few possessions he'd left behind before shipping out to France. She hadn't opened it since the telegram arrived. The pain had been too raw, the memories too vivid. But today, driven by a desperate need for answers, for some tangible connection to the man she'd loved, she reached for it. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. The scent of sandalwood and pipe tobacco, faint but unmistakable, wafted up, instantly transporting her back to happier times. Inside, nestled among his woolen socks and a worn copy of Tess of the D'Urberville, was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. These were the letters she had written to him, filled with the mundane details of her life, her hopes, her fears, her unwavering love. He had carried them with him, a tangible piece of home amidst the horrors of the trenches. Beneath the letters, she found something else. A single, unopened envelope, addressed to her in Albert's familiar handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat. An unsent letter. Why hadn't he sent it? Had he not had the time? Or had he changed his mind? With trembling hands, she carefully opened the envelope. The paper was thin and fragile, the ink slightly faded. The date at the top read, October 10th, 1918. Just days before he died. She began to read, her breath catching in her throat. My dearest Victoria, the guns have been silent for a few hours, a rare and precious respite in this endless nightmare. I find myself thinking of you, of your smile, your laugh, the way you wrinkle your nose when you're concentrating. These memories are all that keep me going, the only light in this suffocating darkness. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you long ago. But fear and a misguided sense of duty held me back. Now, facing the very real possibility that I may not see another sunrise, I can no longer keep it to myself. It's about my family, Victoria. The Shaws are not who they seem. There are secrets, dark and dangerous secrets, that have been passed down through generations. Secrets that could put you in danger if they were ever revealed. Victoria paused, her mind reeling. Secrets?
Danger? What was he talking about?
She continued reading, her heart pounding in her chest. I can't go into details in this letter. It's too risky. But if I don't make it back, I need you to promise me something. Go to Ashworth Manor in Yorkshire. Find my uncle, Lord Ashworth. Tell him that the raven has flown. He'll understand. He's the only one who can protect you. Trust no one else, Victoria. Especially not my cousin, Edward.
He is not what he seems.
The letter ended abruptly there, and signed. Victoria reread it several times, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. Ashworth Manor. Lord Ashworth. The raven has flown. Edward. It was like a cryptic puzzle, a riddle wrapped in a mystery. The whispers from the cemetery, the unsent letter, it was all connected. She was sure of it. Albert hadn't just died in the war. Something else had happened. Something to do with his family, with these dark and dangerous secrets. A wave of fear washed over her, but beneath the fear, a flicker of determination ignited. She had loved Albert. She owed him the truth. She would go to Ashworth Manor. She would find Lord Ashworth. She would unravel the mystery of Albert's death, no matter the cost. She carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box. She closed the lid, the scent of sandalwood and pipe tobacco now tinged with a sense of foreboding. She knew she was stepping into a dangerous world, a world of shadows and secrets. But she was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a woman on a mission, driven by love, loyalty, and a burning desire for justice. She looked out the window, at the gray, oppressive sky. The war had taken much from her, but it hadn't taken her spirit. She would fight for Albert, for his memory, for the truth. And she wouldn't rest until she had uncovered the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of his seemingly ordinary life. The journey would be perilous. She knew, but she was ready. She had a promise to keep, a confession to understand, and a love to avenge. A sudden, sharp rap at the door startled her, cutting through the heavy silence of the room.
Who could that be?
Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The knock came again, more insistent this time, pulling Victoria from the swirling vortex of Albert's letter and the daunting task that lay ahead. She hesitated, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She wasn't expecting anyone. In fact, since Albert's death, visitors had been rare, limited to the occasional sympathetic call from a colleague at the hospital or a strained, awkward visit from Mrs. Henderson, her landlady. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the small, dusty peephole. A man stood on her doorstep, his face obscured by the shadows of the hallway and the brim of his hat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture radiating a sense of authority, even impatience. She couldn't make out his features, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about his stance. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Miss Bennet?"
Victoria Bennet?
The man's voice was deep and resonant, with a slight trace of an accent she couldn't quite place. It sent a shiver down her spine, a prickle of unease that went beyond mere caution. "Yes," she replied, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "My name is Inspector Davies, Scotland Yard. I need to speak with you. It's about Private Albert Shaw." Scotland Yard. Albert. Her heart leaped into her throat. What could they possibly want? Had they discovered something new about his death? Or was this somehow connected to the secrets he'd alluded to in his letter? She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had nothing to hide. She opened the door, but kept the chain latched, leaving only a narrow gap. The man removed his hat, revealing a face that was both stern and surprisingly young. He had sharp, intelligent eyes, a strong jawline, and a neatly trimmed mustache. His gaze was direct, unwavering, making her feel instantly exposed and vulnerable. "Inspector Davies," she said, her voice steadier now. "What is this about?" "May I come in, Miss Bennet? This is a matter of some delicacy." She hesitated for a moment, her instinct screaming at her to be cautious. But she couldn't ignore the authority in his voice, the weight of Scotland Yard behind him. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider, allowing him to enter. The small flat seemed even smaller with the inspector's imposing presence filling the space. He surveyed the room, his eyes taking in every detail, from the worn furniture to the framed photograph of Albert on the mantelpiece. "I understand you were close to Private Shaw," he said, his gaze settling on the photograph. "We were engaged," Victoria replied, her voice tight with emotion. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Bennet." He was a brave man. The words, though meant to be comforting, felt hollow, empty. She nodded curtly, not trusting herself to speak. "We're reopening the investigation into Private Shaw's death," Davies continued, his voice turning serious. Victoria's eyes widened in surprise. "Reopening? But I was told he died in battle."
À shell explosion.
That was the initial report, Davies confirmed. But new information has come to light. Information that suggests foul play. Foul play. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Victoria felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She gripped the back of a chair, steadying herself. What kind of information?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Davies hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm afraid I can't disclose the specifics at this time, Miss Bennet. It's a sensitive matter. But I can tell you that we have reason to believe Private Shaw's death was not accidental." "But who would want to kill Albert?" Victoria asked, her mind racing. She thought of his letter, of the secrets he'd mentioned, of his warning about his cousin, Edward. "That's what we're trying to determine," Davies replied. "We believe it may be connected to his family, to his inheritance." Inheritance? Albert had never mentioned any significant inheritance. He'd always spoken of his family as being comfortably well off, but not wealthy. I don't understand," Victoria said, shaking her head. "Miss Bennet, did Private Shaw ever mention anything to you about his family? Any disagreements? Any enemies?" Victoria thought back to their conversations, to the snippets of information he'd shared about his life before the war. She remembered him talking about his uncle, Lord Ashworth, with a mixture of respect and apprehension. She also remembered him mentioning his cousin, Edward, with a distinct lack of warmth. He mentioned his uncle," she said slowly. "Lord Ashworth. He said he was a powerful man, and he didn't seem to trust his cousin, Edward." Davies' eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he say why?"
Victoria Geshetati.
She thought of the letter, tucked away safely in Albert's box. Should she tell the inspector about it? It felt like a betrayal of Albert's trust, but at the same time, it might be the key to solving the mystery of his death. He wrote me a letter," she said, her voice trembling. "Just before he died. He said there were secrets. Dangerous secrets. He told me to go to Ashworth Manor to speak to his uncle." Davies leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Do you have this letter, Miss Bennet?"
Victoria nodded. "Yes."
I found it this morning. I need to see it, Miss Bennet. It could be crucial evidence." Victoria hesitated again. This was all happening so fast. She felt overwhelmed, caught in a web of intrigue and danger she didn't understand. But she knew she had to cooperate. She had to do everything she could to find out the truth about Albert's death. She went to the mantelpiece, her hands shaking as she retrieved the box. The inspector's presence radiated a sense of gravity, of impending revelation. She took a deep breath. It felt as though the shadows of Albert's past were about to engulf her. Chapter 4. The Widow's Veil. Victoria carefully extracted the letter from the box, her fingers brushing against the other mementos of Albert's life. The faded ribbon, the worn book, the scent of sandalwood, each a painful reminder of what she had lost. She handed the letter to Inspector Davies, her hand trembling slightly. He took it with a solemn nod, his expression unreadable. He unfolded the fragile paper and began to read, his eyes scanning the lines of Albert's handwriting. Victoria watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation churning within her. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the distant rumble of traffic outside. As Davies read, his eyebrows furrowed, his lips tightening into a thin line. He finished the letter and reread it, his gaze lingering on certain passages. He looked up at Victoria, his expression grave. "This changes things, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice low. "This letter confirms our suspicions. Private Shaw's death was no accident." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected as much, but to hear it confirmed, to have the reality of it laid bare, was devastating. "The raven has flown," Davies murmured, repeating the cryptic phrase from the letter. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Victoria shook her head.
No.
It was the first time I'd ever heard it. He said his uncle would understand. "Lord Ashworth," Davies said, more to himself than to Victoria. "We've been trying to reach him, but he's proving elusive." "Elusive?" Victoria echoed, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "He's not at Ashworth Manor," Davies explained. "Apparently, he left shortly after receiving news of his nephew's death. No one seems to know where he is." This was unsettling news. Albert had clearly trusted his uncle, had believed he was the only one who could protect her. But if Lord Ashworth had disappeared, who could she turn to? "And Edward?" Victoria asked, remembering Albert's warning. "His cousin?" Davies' expression darkened. "Edward Ashworth is a person of interest in this investigation, Miss Bennet. We have reason to believe he may have been involved in Private Shaw's death." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Edward. She had never met him, but Albert's words, his clear distrust, painted a chilling picture.
"But why?"
She whispered. "What would be his motive?" "Inheritance, Miss Bennet," Davies replied, his voice grim. "It seems Lord Ashworth is a very wealthy man, and with Private Shaw out of the way, Edward Ashworth stands to inherit a considerable fortune." Victoria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It was all so sordid, so cruel. To think that Albert's own cousin might have been responsible for his death, all for the sake of money, was almost unbearable. "What would happen now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We'll continue our investigation, Miss Bennet," Davies said. "We'll find Lord Ashworth, and we'll question Edward Ashworth. And we'll do everything we can to bring those responsible for Private Shaw's death to justice." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "I know this is difficult for you, Miss Bennet, but I need your cooperation. You may be in danger."
Danger.
The word echoed in her ears, a chilling reminder of Albert's warning. She thought of the whispers in the cemetery, the feeling of being watched. What should I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For now, stay here," Davies said. "Don't go to Ashworth Manor. Not yet. It's too risky. We don't know who we can trust." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver whistle. "If you need anything, if you feel threatened in any way, blow this whistle. Loudly. Someone will come." He handed her the whistle, his fingers brushing against hers. She took it, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his touch. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded. "I'll be in touch, Miss Bennet. And be careful." He turned to leave, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. He paused at the door, looking back at her. "One more thing, Miss Bennet," he said. "Did Private Shaw ever mention anything about a secret society? Or a clandestine organization?" Victoria's eyes widened in surprise. A secret society? This was getting stranger and stranger. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Never." "What makes you ask?" Davies hesitated.
"Just a hunch," he said.
Something in his letter, the way he phrased things. It suggests a deeper, a more complex conspiracy. He left, closing the door behind him, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts, her fears, and the heavy weight of the secrets she was now carrying. The feeling of being in danger had magnified tenfold. Who could she truly trust? A darkness, deeper than simple grief, began to close around her. She clutched the silver whistle, its metallic chill a small, cold comfort. Chapter 5. A Stranger's Face. The days following Inspector Davies' visit were a blur of anxiety and apprehension. Victoria found herself jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder, the feeling of being watched intensifying. She barely slept, her nights filled with troubled dreams, the whispers from the cemetery echoing in her subconscious. The silver whistle, a constant weight in her pocket, offered a small measure of reassurance, but it also served as a constant reminder of the danger she was in. She continued to go to work at the hospital, finding a strange solace in the routine, in the task of caring for the wounded. The endless stream of injured soldiers, their bodies and minds bearing the scars of war, helped to distract her, if only temporarily, from her own troubles. But even amidst the chaos of the ward, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was tracking her every move. One afternoon, as she was leaving the hospital, she noticed a man standing across the street. He was leaning against a lamppost, seemingly engrossed in reading a newspaper, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. He was tall and slender, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. He was wearing a dark suit and a fedora, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the hat's brim. She paused, her heart beating faster. Was he one of Inspector Davies' men, keeping an eye on her? Or was he someone else, someone connected to Albert's family, to the secrets that had led to his death? She hesitated for a moment, then decided to approach him. If he was with Scotland Yard, she had nothing to fear. And if he wasn't well, she needed to know. As she crossed the street, the man looked up from his newspaper. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, met hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, surprise, perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Are you waiting for someone?" The man folded his newspaper, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps," he replied, his voice smooth and cultured, with a hint of that same accent she'd noticed in Inspector Davies' voice, but different, more refined. "And perhaps I was simply admiring the view." His gaze lingered on her, making her feel uncomfortable, exposed. She felt a sudden urge to flee, to run back to the safety of the hospital. I don't understand," she said, stammering slightly. "Don't you?" he replied, his smile widening. "I think you do, Miss Bennet. I think you understand, more than you let on." His words sent a shiver down her spine. How did he know her name? And what did he mean by that cryptic remark? Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man stepped closer, his blue eyes piercing hers. "Let's just say I'm a friend," he replied. "A friend of Albert's." A friend of Albert's? She had never heard Albert mention anyone who looked like this man. She searched his face, trying to find some resemblance, some clue that might connect him to the man she'd loved. But there was nothing. I don't believe you," she said, her voice shaking. The man chuckled softly. "Believe what you will, Miss Bennet. But I know things. Things about Albert, about his family, about the secrets he was keeping." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. This man was dangerous, she was sure of it. But he also seemed to know something about Albert, something that might help her uncover the truth. What do you know?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know that he was murdered, Miss Bennet. And I know who did it." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Who?" she whispered. "Tell me." The man smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. "Not here," he said. "It's not safe. Meet me tonight, at the stroke of midnight, by the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens. Come alone." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustling crowd, leaving Victoria standing there, stunned and bewildered. The Albert Memorial. Midnight. Alone. It was a trap, she was sure of it. But it was also a chance to find out the truth about Albert's death. She looked around, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, searching for any sign of Inspector Davies or his men. But there was no one. She was alone. She had a decision to make. Should she trust this stranger, this self-proclaimed friend of Albert's? Or should she heed Inspector Davies' warning and stay away? The risks were enormous, but the potential reward, the truth about Albert's murder, was too great to ignore. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The city, with its noise and bustle, suddenly felt menacing, a labyrinth of hidden dangers. A cold wind swept through the street, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the chilling premonition of a storm brewing, both within and without. She clutched the silver whistle in her coat pocket. The decision was hers, and hers alone. Chapter 6. Beneath the Wounded Sky. The hours leading up to midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Victoria paced her small flat, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Should she go to the Albert Memorial? Or should she stay put, as Inspector Davies had advised? The stranger's words echoed in her mind. I know who did it. The promise of answers, of justice for Albert, was a powerful lure. But the fear, the very real possibility that it was a trap, was equally strong. She tried to distract herself, busying herself with small, meaningless tasks. She tidied her already tidy flat. She mended a tear in her dress. She even attempted to read, but the words blurred before her eyes, her mind unable to focus on anything but the impending meeting. As the evening wore on, the weather outside deteriorated. The wind picked up, howling through the streets, rattling the windows of her flat. Rain began to fall, a steady, relentless downpour that mirrored the turmoil within her. She looked out the window, at the dark, rain-soaked city, and shivered. She thought of Albert, of his smile, his laugh, the way he used to hold her hand. The memories, once a source of comfort, now brought a fresh wave of grief, a sharp, piercing pain that made her chest ache. She had to do this for him. She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed 11, she made her decision. She would go to the Albert Memorial. She would meet the stranger. She would face her fears and uncover the secrets that had led to Albert's death. She put on her warmest coat, a thick, woolen garment that had belonged to Albert. She wrapped a scarf around her head, pulling it low to shield her face from the rain. She slipped the silver whistle into her pocket, its cold metal a small reassurance against her trembling hand. She left her flat, locking the door behind her. The streets were deserted, the only sound the wind and the rain. She walked quickly, her head down, her eyes scanning the shadows, her senses on high alert. The journey to Kensington Gardens seemed to take forever. The rain soaked through her coat, chilling her to the bone. The wind whipped at her, trying to tear the scarf from her head. She pressed on, her determination fueled by a mixture of grief, anger, and a desperate need for answers. As she approached the Albert Memorial, she saw him. He was standing beneath the towering monument, silhouetted against the flickering gaslights, his figure shrouded in darkness. He was alone. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She approached him, her footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. You came, he said, his voice barely audible above the wind and the rain. You said you knew who killed Albert, she replied, her voice trembling. Tell me. The man smiled, a cold, unsettling smile. Patience, Miss Bennet. All in good time. He stepped closer, his blue eyes piercing hers. She could see his face more clearly now, the sharp cheekbones, the thin lips, the neatly trimmed mustache. He was handsome in a cold, calculating way. Who are you? She asked, her voice shaking. Albert never mentioned you. He wouldn't have, the man replied. Our association was a secret. A necessary secret. What association? Victoria pressed, her heart pounding. Let's just say we were both working for the same cause, he replied cryptically. A cause that Albert ultimately betrayed. Betrayed? What was he talking about? Albert had been a loyal soldier, a faithful patriot. He would never have betrayed his country. I don't believe you, she said, her voice rising. The man shrugged. Believe what you will, but I know the truth. And the truth is, Albert was a liability. He knew too much. He had to be silenced. Victoria felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. You killed him? She whispered, her voice hoarse with horror. The man's smile widened. Not me personally, Miss Bennet. I merely facilitated his demise. He reached into his coat, his hand disappearing inside. Victoria's eyes widened in terror. Was he reaching for a weapon? She fumbled for the silver whistle in her pocket, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely grasp it. She brought it to her lips, ready to blow. But before she could, the man pulled his hand out of his coat. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, leather-bound book. This belonged to Albert, he said, his voice softening slightly. It contains certain information. Information that could be very damaging to certain people. He held out the book to her. Victoria hesitated, her mind racing. What was this book? What secrets did it contain? Was this another trap? The rain continued to fall, the wind howling around them. The Albert Memorial loomed above them, a silent witness to their confrontation. The wounded sky wept. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken accusations and a terrifying uncertainty. She had to make a choice. Chapter 7. The Soldier's Locket. Victoria's gaze flickered between the man's piercing blue eyes and the leather-bound book he held out to her. Her mind was a tempest of doubt and suspicion. Was this a genuine offer, a key to unlocking the mystery surrounding Albert's death? Or was it another layer of deception, a carefully laid trap designed to silence her, just as Albert had been silenced? She took a tentative step forward, her hand reaching out almost involuntarily. The rain plastered her hair to her forehead, blurring her vision, but she could still see the faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on the man's lips. It was a smirk that sent a fresh wave of unease through her. What kind of information? She asked, her voice barely a whisper above the relentless drumming of the rain. Information that could bring down an empire, Miss Bennet, he replied, his voice low and conspiratorial. Information that certain people would kill to protect. He opened the book slightly, revealing a glimpse of handwritten text, diagrams, and what looked like coded messages. It was clearly something significant, something dangerous. Why are you giving this to me? She asked, her voice trembling. If it's so dangerous, why not destroy it? The man shrugged, his shoulders moving slightly beneath his rain-soaked coat. Let's just say I have my reasons. And I believe you're the only one who can be trusted with it. Trusted? Why her? She was just a grieving widow, a nurse, a woman caught in a web of intrigue. She didn't understand. She wasn't a spy, a detective, a soldier. She hesitated for a moment longer, her mind racing. She thought of Albert, of his letter, of his warning about his cousin, Edward. She thought of Inspector Davies, of his suspicions, of his promise to find justice for Albert. She made her decision. She reached out and took the book. The leather was cold and damp beneath her fingers. It felt heavy, weighted down with the secrets it contained. What am I supposed to do with this? She asked, her voice shaking. Take it to someone you trust, the man replied. Someone in authority. Someone who can expose the truth. Someone she trusted. Inspector Davies. He was the only one she could think of. But how could she get to him? She couldn't go back to her flat, not now. She was being watched, she was sure of it. I don't know where to go, she said, her voice filled with despair. The man smiled, a knowing smile. I can help you with that, he said. There's a safe house. Not far from here. You'll be safe there, for a while at least. A safe house. It sounded too good to be true. Was this another trap? She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. But his gaze was steady, unwavering. How do I know I can trust you? She asked, her voice pleading. The man reached into his coat again, and this time, he pulled out something else. A small, silver locket. It was shaped like a heart, and it was engraved with intricate designs. Victoria gasped. She recognized it instantly. It was Albert's locket. He had worn it always, a gift from her on their first anniversary. He had told her it contained a picture of her, a reminder of his love for her, even in the midst of war. The man opened the locket, revealing the tiny, faded photograph inside. It was her, a younger, happier version of herself, her eyes sparkling with love and hope. He gave this to me, the man said, his voice softening slightly. Just before he died. He told me to find you, to protect you. Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. The sight of the locket, the tangible proof of Albert's love, broke through her defenses, her fear, her suspicion. He trusted you? She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The man nodded.
He did.
And now you must trust me too, Miss Bennet. We don't have much time. He closed the locket and handed it to her. She took it, her fingers closing around it tightly. It was warm from his touch, a small spark of warmth in the cold, rain-soaked night. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. All right, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I trust you. Take me to the safe house. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes. Follow me, he said. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, and Victoria, clutching the locket and the leather-bound book, followed him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, hope, and a renewed determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime and the secrets of the city, leaving a clean, albeit dangerous, path ahead. The locket felt heavy in her hand, a tangible link to the past and a guide towards an uncertain future. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Front. The safe house was located in a quiet, unassuming street in Bloomsbury, not far from Victoria's own flat. It was a small, terraced house, indistinguishable from the others on the row, its windows dark and shuttered. The man, who had introduced himself as Thomas, led her through a narrow alleyway to a back entrance, a nondescript door painted a dull, unremarkable gray. He produced a key, unlocked the door, and ushered her inside. The interior was dimly lit, a single gas lamp casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was sparsely furnished, with only a few basic pieces of furniture, a worn armchair, a small table, a narrow bed in the corner. The air was thick with a scent of dust and damp, a musty odor that reminded Victoria of the trenches she had seen in photographs, the dugouts where soldiers had sought shelter from the relentless shelling. It's not much, Thomas said, his voice apologetic, but it's safe. No one knows about this place. Victoria looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was certainly not luxurious, but it felt secure. A haven from the storm, both literal and metaphorical, that had been raging around her. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere. I appreciate this. Thomas nodded. Get some rest, he said. You'll need it. We have a lot to do tomorrow. He turned to leave, but Victoria stopped him. Thomas, she said, her voice hesitant. Tell me, how did you know Albert? Thomas paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. We served together, he replied, his voice low. In the same regiment. We were close. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. He had been there in the trenches with Albert. He had witnessed the horrors of war, the same horrors that had claimed Albert's life. Did you see him die? She asked, her voice trembling. Thomas hesitated. I saw the aftermath, he replied, his voice grim. The shell explosion, it was horrific. Victoria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image, the gruesome reality of Albert's death. I'm sorry, Thomas said, his voice softening. I know this is difficult for you. She nodded, unable to speak. He talked about you, Thomas continued. All the time. He loved you very much. Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She clutched Albert's locket, the cold metal a small comfort against her aching heart. He was a good man, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The best, Thomas agreed. And he was my friend. I owe it to him to find out the truth, to bring those responsible for his death to justice. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a fierce determination. We'll do this together, Victoria, he said. We'll uncover the secrets, expose the conspiracy, and avenge Albert's death. His words, his unwavering commitment, gave her a surge of strength, a renewed sense of purpose. She was not alone in this. She had an ally, a comrade, a fellow soldier in this battle against the shadows. Thank you, Thomas, she said, her voice stronger now. I trust you. He nodded. Get some sleep, he said. I'll be back in the morning. He left, closing the door behind him, leaving Victoria alone in the dim, quiet room. She sat down on the narrow bed, her body aching with exhaustion. She opened the leather-bound book, Albert's book, and began to read. The handwriting was familiar, Albert's distinctive script, but the content was unlike anything she had ever seen from him before. It was filled with coded messages, cryptic symbols, diagrams of what looked like military installations, and lists of names, some of which she recognized, names of prominent figures in government, in the military, and high society. She spent hours poring over the book, trying to decipher the codes, to make sense of the information. It was like a complex puzzle, a labyrinth of secrets that seemed to stretch far beyond Albert's death, far beyond the confines of Ashworth Manor, far beyond anything she could have imagined. She felt as if she was touching the outer edges of a massive conspiracy, a network of deceit and betrayal. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the shutters, she finally drifted off to sleep, the book clutched tightly in her hand, her mind filled with images of trenches, explosions, secret codes, and the unwavering blue eyes of the man who had promised to help her. The echoes of the front, the sounds of war, mingled with the whispers from the cemetery, creating a symphony of sorrow and suspense that followed her into her dreams. Chapter 9. The Forbidden Path. Victoria awoke to the sound of a gentle knocking on the door. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, the remnants of unsettling dreams clinging to the edges of her consciousness. The room was still dimly lit, the gray light of dawn filtering through the shutters. She remembered where she was the safe house, the leather-bound book, Thomas's promise of help. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Victoria? It's Thomas." She got out of bed, her muscles stiff and sore from sleeping on the narrow mattress. She smoothed down her wrinkled dress, feeling a pang of longing for the simple comforts of her own home, her own life, before it had been shattered by Albert's death and the secrets that had followed. She opened the door, and Thomas stepped inside. He was carrying a tray with a pot of tea and some bread and cheese. The aroma of the tea, strong and fragrant, filled the small room, a welcome contrast to the musty odor of damp and dust. "I brought you some breakfast," he said, his voice cheerful. "You must be hungry." She was, in fact, ravenously hungry. She hadn't eaten properly in days, her appetite suppressed by anxiety and fear. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice sincere. "That's very kind of you." He set the tray down on the small table, and they sat down together, sharing the meager meal. The silence between them was comfortable, a companionable quiet that spoke of a shared understanding, a shared purpose. Did you sleep all right?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Victoria hesitated. "Not really," she admitted. "I had nightmares." Thomas nodded, his expression understanding. "The war, it leaves its mark on all of us," he said. "Even those who didn't fight." She looked at him, at his strong, weathered face, his blue eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and determination. She wondered about his experiences, about the horrors he had witnessed, the scars he carried. "Tell me about it," she said, her voice soft. "Tell me about the war." "About Albert." Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window, as if looking back at a distant, painful past. Then, he began to speak, his voice low and measured, recounting stories of their time in the trenches, the camaraderie, the fear, the constant threat of death. He spoke of Albert's bravery, his kindness, his unwavering loyalty to his friends, to his country. He also spoke of the darker side of war, the corruption, the incompetence, the senseless waste of life. He spoke of the whispers, the rumors of a secret organization within the military, an organization that was pulling the strings, manipulating events for its own nefarious purposes. Albert stumbled upon something, Thomas said, his voice grim. Something he shouldn't have seen. Something that put him in danger. Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. "The book," she said, her voice trembling. "It's all in the book, isn't it?" Thomas nodded. "The book is the key," he said. "It contains the evidence, the proof of their treachery. But it's also a target. They'll be looking for it, Victoria. They'll stop at nothing to get it back." Victoria felt a wave of fear wash over her. She thought of Inspector Davies, of his warning about danger. She thought of the cryptic phrase from Albert's letter, "The raven has flown." "We need to get the book to Inspector Davies," she said, her voice urgent. "He's the only one we can trust." Thomas shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "It's too risky. Davies is being watched, I'm sure of it. We need to find a safer way, a more secure channel." "But who?" Victoria asked, her voice filled with despair. "Who else can we trust?" Thomas paused, his gaze thoughtful.
"There's one person," he said.
"Someone who might be able to help us. Someone who has connections, influence, power. But it's a long shot. And it's dangerous." "Who is it?" Victoria pressed, her curiosity piqued. "Lord Ashworth," Thomas replied, his voice low. Victoria's eyes widened in surprise. Lord Ashworth, Albert's uncle, the man he had told her to find, the man who was supposed to protect her. But Inspector Davies had said he was missing, elusive. "But Inspector Davies said he couldn't find him," she said, her voice confused. "Davies doesn't know everything," Thomas replied. "I have contacts. I know where to find him. But it's a journey, Victoria. A dangerous journey." He looked at her, his blue eyes piercing hers. "Are you willing to take the risk?" he asked. "Are you willing to follow the forbidden path, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost?" Victoria thought of Albert, of his love, of his sacrifice. She thought of the secrets, the lies, the betrayal. She thought of the leather-bound book, the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. She felt the familiar surge of anger and determination. The path ahead was filled with danger, but she wouldn't shy from it. She owed that to Albert. She owed to herself. She met Thomas's gaze, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I'm ready. I'll go with you." He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Good," he said. "Then let's go. Let's find Lord Ashworth and finally finish this." A sense of foreboding hung in the air between them, but it was overwhelmed by determination. They were walking a perilous path, but it was a path they were determined to walk together. Chapter 10. The Secrets of Ashworth Manor. The journey to Ashworth Manor was long and arduous. They traveled by train, then by a hired motorcar, traversing the sprawling countryside of Yorkshire. The landscape, a tapestry of rolling hills, verdant fields, and ancient woodlands, was a stark contrast to the grimy, war-torn streets of London. But even amidst the beauty of the natural world, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of being watched, of being pursued. Thomas was cautious and vigilant, constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from the pistol he carried concealed beneath his coat. He spoke little, his focus entirely on their safety, on reaching their destination without being detected. Victoria, meanwhile, spent the journey studying Albert's book, trying to decipher the coded messages, to piece together the puzzle of the conspiracy he had uncovered. The more she read, the more she realized the magnitude of the secrets it contained, the far-reaching implications of the information Albert had stumbled upon. It was a web of deceit and betrayal that stretched to the highest levels of government, of the military, of society itself. As they approached Ashworth Manor, Victoria felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. This was where Albert had grown up, where he had spent his childhood, where the secrets of his family were buried. It was a place of both familiarity and foreboding, a place that held both the promise of answers and the threat of danger. The manor itself was an imposing structure, a sprawling stone mansion perched atop a hill overlooking a vast estate. It was ancient and grand, its walls weathered by time and the elements, its windows dark and mysterious. It exuded an aura of power, of wealth, of secrets hidden within its walls. Thomas parked the motor car a distance from the manor, concealed among a cluster of trees. "We'll approach on foot," he said, his voice low. "It's less conspicuous." They set off across the fields, the long grass brushing against their legs, the wind whipping their hair. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the threat of rain. The manor loomed before them, its silhouette stark against the gray sky, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. As they drew closer, Victoria noticed signs of neglect. The gardens, once meticulously manicured, were now overgrown and wild. The stone walls were crumbling in places, the paint peeling from the window frames. It was as if the manor itself was in mourning, grieving the loss of its heir, the unraveling of its secrets. They reached the edge of the estate, a high stone wall that surrounded the property. Thomas found a hidden gate, overgrown with ivy, and carefully unlocked it. They slipped inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick vegetation. They made their way through the overgrown gardens, their senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rustling of leaves, the distant caw of a crow. It felt as if they were being watched, as if the very walls of the manor had eyes. They reached the main house, a massive oak door, studded with iron nails, standing guard at the entrance. Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. Victoria nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched Albert's locket, the cold metal a small comfort against her trembling hand. Thomas took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The interior was dark and cavernous, a vast hall stretching before them, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow them as they entered. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a musty odor that spoke of generations of secrets hidden within these walls. A grand staircase swept upwards, disappearing into the shadows above. The silence was deafening, the sense of foreboding overwhelming. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the hall. "Who's there?" They froze, their hearts leaping into their throats. A figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly man, tall and gaunt, with a stern face and piercing eyes. He was wearing a dark suit, his clothes impeccably tailored, despite the overall air of neglect surrounding the manor. "Lord Ashworth?" Thomas asked, his voice steady. The man's eyes narrowed.
"Who are you?
"And what are you doing here?" Thomas stepped forward, his hand moving towards his coat, towards the pistol concealed beneath.
"We need to talk to you," he said.
"It's about Albert." The tension in the hall was palpable. A confrontation seemed inevitable. Secrets, long buried, were about to surface. The weight of Ashworth Manor, and all it represented, pressed down on Victoria. The past and present were colliding. Chapter 11. A Dance with Deception. Lord Ashworth's gaze, sharp and assessing, swept over Thomas and then fixed on Victoria. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a flicker of something else, suspicion, perhaps, or even fear. He took a step back, his hand instinctively moving towards a small, silver bell that sat on a nearby table. "I don't know you," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "And I have nothing to say about my nephew. His death was a tragedy, a consequence of war. Now leave my property before I call the authorities." "We know it wasn't an accident, Lord Ashworth," Thomas said, his voice firm. "We know Albert was murdered. And we know it has something to do with the secrets this family has been keeping for generations." Lord Ashworth's face paled slightly, but he maintained his composure.
"You're mistaken," he said.
"There are no secrets, just grief and loss." "The raven has flown," Victoria said, stepping forward. The cryptic phrase from Albert's letter felt heavy on her tongue, a key to unlocking the truth. Lord Ashworth's eyes widened in surprise. He stared at Victoria, his gaze searching, questioning. Where did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "From Albert," Victoria replied. "In a letter. A letter he wrote just before he died." Lord Ashworth's composure finally cracked. He slumped slightly, his shoulders sagging, his age suddenly seeming to weigh heavily upon him. "He told you," he murmured, more to himself than to Victoria. "He actually told you." "He told me to come here," Victoria continued. "He said you were the only one who could protect me. He said not to trust Edward." The mention of Edward's name seemed to jolt Lord Ashworth back to reality. He straightened up, his eyes hardening. "Edward," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disdain. That viper. He's behind all of this, isn't he?" "We believe so," Thomas replied. "We believe he was involved in Albert's murder. and we believe he's after something. Something Albert had. The book, Lord Ashworth said, his gaze shifting to Victoria. Albert's journal. Do you have it? Victoria nodded, her hand instinctively moving to the pocket where she had kept the leather-bound book safe. It's dangerous, Victoria, Lord Ashworth said, his voice urgent. Edward will stop at nothing to get it. He's obsessed with power, with the family legacy, with the organization. The organization? Victoria echoed, remembering Inspector Davies' question about a secret society. Lord Ashworth hesitated, his gaze flickering around the hall, as if checking for eavesdroppers.
It's a long story, he said.
A complicated story. But yes, there is an organization. A secret society that has been operating in the shadows for centuries. They call themselves the Order of the Raven. The Order of the Raven. The word sent a chill down Victoria's spine. It was all starting to make sense, the cryptic messages in Albert's book, the whispers of a conspiracy, the sense of being watched, of being hunted. Albert stumbled upon their secrets. Lord Ashworth continued. He discovered their plans, their treachery. He tried to expose them, but they silenced him. And Edward is a member? Victoria asked, her voice trembling. Lord Ashworth nodded grimly. He's more than a member, he said. He's one of their leaders. He's ambitious, ruthless, and completely devoid of conscience. We need to get the book to someone in authority, Victoria said. Someone who can expose them, bring them to justice. Not yet, Lord Ashworth said. It's too risky. Edward has eyes and ears everywhere, even within Scotland Yard. Victoria's heart sank. She had trusted Inspector Davies, had believed he was her only hope. But if even he couldn't be trusted, who could she turn to? There's one person, Lord Ashworth said, his voice thoughtful. Someone who might be able to help us. Someone who is beyond Edward's reach. Someone who has the power and the influence to take on the Order of the Raven. He paused. A name hung unspoken in the air. A name so unexpected. A name connected to a deep secret. Lord Ashworth finally broke the heavy silence that had fallen over them, a silence pregnant with fear and a terrible hope. He looked directly at Victoria. We need the help of someone he started. Someone who even they are afraid of. A floorboard creaked ominously upstairs. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. The creak of the floorboard above sent a jolt of fear through Victoria. Her gaze shot upwards, towards the dark, shadowy landing above the grand staircase. Thomas, too, reacted instantly, his hand moving to the pistol concealed beneath his coat. Lord Ashworth, his face pale, held up a hand, signaling for silence. They stood frozen, listening intently, their senses on high alert. The silence stretched, heavy and ominous, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the hall. Had they been discovered? Was Edward, or one of his henchmen, lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting to pounce? After what seemed like an eternity, Lord Ashworth slowly lowered his hand. It's probably nothing, he said, his voice strained, though his eyes betrayed a lingering unease. This old house, it makes noises. But Victoria wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by danger, was stronger than ever. She clutched Albert's locket, the cold metal a small comfort against her racing heart. We need to be careful, Thomas said, his voice low. We don't know who we can trust. Indeed, Lord Ashworth agreed. Especially not within these walls. He looked at Victoria, his gaze intense. The person I was about to mention, it's someone Edward would never suspect. Someone who has been hidden away, for her own protection. Who is it? Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lord Ashworth hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the staircase, as if still wary of being overheard. My daughter, he said, his voice barely audible. Albert's cousin. Amelia. Victoria's eyes widened in surprise. Albert had never mentioned a sister. He had always spoken of his cousin Edward as if he were an only child. This was another layer of deception, another secret hidden within the tangled web of the Ashworth family. But Albert never said, she stammered. He wouldn't have known, Lord Ashworth replied. Amelia was sent away, long ago, before Albert was even born. It was for her own safety. to protect her from the influence of the Order. Where is she? Thomas asked, his voice pragmatic. She's here, Lord Ashworth replied. In the manor. Hidden. In a secret room, known only to me. A secret room. It sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, a far cry from the reality of their situation. But Victoria knew that this was no fiction. This was a matter of life and death, a battle against a powerful and ruthless enemy. We need to get to her, Victoria said, her voice urgent. She might be able to help us. She might know something about the Order, about Edward's plans. Lord Ashworth nodded. But we must be cautious, he said. Edward mustn't suspect a thing. He believes Amelia is dead. If he knew she was alive, he didn't finish the sentence, but Victoria understood. Edward would stop at nothing to silence anyone who posed a threat to his power, to his ambition. How do we get to this secret room? Thomas asked, his voice practical. Lord Ashworth led them to a small, unassuming door at the back of the hall, hidden behind a heavy tapestry. He pressed a hidden button, and the door clicked open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. This leads to the old servants' quarters, he explained, and from there to Amelia's room. He looked at Victoria, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Be careful, he said, and tell her I love her. He stepped aside, allowing Victoria and Thomas to enter the passageway. The door clicked shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. Thomas lit a small lantern, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. They made their way through the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing softly in the silence. The air was cold and damp, the scent of dust and decay even stronger than in the main hall. It felt as if they were descending into the bowels of the earth, into a hidden world of secrets and lies. As they walked, Victoria couldn't help but wonder about Amelia, this hidden cousin, this secret daughter. What kind of life had she led, hidden away in this ancient manor, protected from the world, but also imprisoned by it? What secrets did she know? And would she be willing to help them? The passageway twisted and turned, leading them deeper and deeper into the heart of the manor. Victoria felt a sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being trapped, of being overwhelmed by the weight of the secrets that surrounded them. Finally, they reached another door, this one made of solid oak, reinforced with iron bars. Thomas tried the handle, but it was locked. Stand back, he said, his voice low. He drew his pistol and fired a single shot at the lock. The sound echoed through the passageway, deafening in the confined space. The lock shattered, and the door swung open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room. A single window, covered with heavy curtains, provided the only source of light. And in the center of the room, sitting in a worn armchair, was a young woman. She was pale and thin, with dark hair and large, haunting eyes. She looked up at them, her expression startled, fearful. It was clear she had no idea who they were, or what horrors lay beyond the walls of her hidden prison. The price of loyalty to the Ashworth family, it seemed, was steep indeed. Chapter 13. Broken Vows. The young woman, Amelia, stared at them with wide, frightened eyes. She looked fragile, almost ethereal, like a porcelain doll that had been locked away in an attic for years. Her dark hair, unkempt and tangled, framed a face that was both beautiful and hauntingly sad. Who are you? She asked, her voice trembling, barely a whisper. What do you want? Victoria stepped forward, her heart aching for this young woman, this hidden cousin of Albert's, who had lived a life of isolation and fear. My name is Victoria Bennet, she said, her voice soft and reassuring. And this is Thomas. We were friends of Albert's. Amelia's eyes widened slightly. Albert? She echoed, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and longing. You knew Albert? We were very close, Victoria replied. He was my fiancé. Amelia's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. He never mentioned me, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. He wouldn't have known about you, Thomas interjected. Your father kept you hidden for your own protection. Amelia looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously in her lap. Protection, she murmured, her voice laced with bitterness. Is that what he called it? Imprisonment is more like it. We know about the Order of the Raven, Amelia, Victoria said gently. We know about Edward, about his plans. We need your help. Amelia's head snapped up, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. The Order, she whispered, her voice trembling. You know about the Order? Albert discovered their secrets, Thomas explained. He was trying to expose them, but they killed him. Amelia's face paled. She closed her eyes, her body shaking slightly. I always feared something like this would happen, she whispered. They're ruthless, merciless. They'll stop at nothing to protect their power. We have Albert's book, Victoria said, pulling the leather-bound journal from her pocket. It contains evidence, proof of their treachery. But we need to get it to someone who can expose them, bring them to justice. Amelia's eyes fixed on the book, her gaze intense. That book, she whispered. It's dangerous. Edward has been searching for it for years. He believes it contains the key to ultimate power. Ultimate power? Victoria echoed, her voice confused. What does that mean? Amelia hesitated, her gaze flickering around the room, as if wary of being overheard, even in this hidden sanctuary. The Order, they're not just interested in political power, in wealth, in influence, she explained. They seek something more. Something ancient, something mystical. They believe there is a source of power, hidden somewhere in the world, a power that can give them control over everything. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. This was more than just a conspiracy, more than just a struggle for political dominance. This was something far darker, far more dangerous. And Edward believes the book will lead him to this power? Thomas asked, his voice skeptical. Amelia nodded. He's obsessed with it, she said. He's convinced it contains the clues, the map, the key to unlocking this ancient power. We need to get the book to someone who can stop him, Victoria said, her voice urgent. Someone who can expose the Order, bring them to justice. There's no one, Amelia said, her voice filled with despair. The Order has infiltrated every level of society, every branch of government. They have eyes and ears everywhere. We can't trust anyone. Your father mentioned someone, Thomas said. Someone beyond Edward's reach. Someone who has the power and the influence to take on the Order. Amelia's expression was blank. Who? I do not know who my father could have referred to. Victoria was feeling increasingly desperate. She clutched at straws. The Queen? Surely. Even they would not dare go against the monarchy? Amelia shook her head, her face paling further. The Queen is compromised. They have something on her. A past indiscretion. A secret marriage before she ascended to the throne. A marriage that was never officially recognized. A marriage that produced a child. Victoria and Thomas exchanged stunned glances. This was a revelation of staggering proportions, a secret that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy, of the country itself. And Edward knows about this? Victoria asked, her voice trembling. Amelia nodded. He's using it to blackmail her, she said. To control her. To force her to do his bidding. But the child, Victoria pressed. What happened to the child? Amelia explained, in a halting and barely audible whisper, that the child had been given away, raised in secret, and was completely unknown within the royal court. Victoria asked, and does nobody know the child's identity? Amelia shook her head. Only Edward. And my father knows the full truth. My father was entrusted with arranging everything. It was he who secured the child's safe passage into a new life, a new identity. She stopped. It was a lot of information to give at once. A silence fell. Broken vows and a nation's secrets. The air felt colder, heavier. Victoria realized something with chilling certainty. The unsent letter. Albert mentioned protecting me, she whispered. Thomas looked at her sharply. From the family secrets, Amelia's eyes were wide. It was a new truth dawning. Chapter 14. The Serpent's Coil. Victoria's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and fragmented, were beginning to coalesce, forming a picture that was both terrifying and profoundly personal. Albert's letter, his warning about his family's secrets, his plea for her to seek Lord Ashworth's protection, it was all connected, not just to the Order of the Raven, but to her own life, to her own identity.
Protect you?
Thomas asked, his voice sharp, his gaze fixed on Victoria.
What did he mean by that?
Victoria hesitated, her mind reeling. She thought of her own past, her shrouded origins, the mystery surrounding her birth. She had always known she was adopted, raised by a kindly couple who had loved her as their own. But they had died when she was young, leaving her with few details about her true parentage. I don't know, she stammered. I always assumed he was just being protective. Because of the war, because of the danger, but it was more than that. Amelia said, her voice low, her eyes filled with a dawning understanding. It was much more than that. She looked at Victoria, her gaze intense. What do you know about your parents? She asked. About your birth? Victoria felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. This was a path she had always been reluctant to tread, a past she had tried to leave behind. But now, it seemed, she had no choice. The truth, however painful, was about to be revealed. I was adopted, she said, her voice trembling. My adoptive parents, they told me I was found on their doorstep, as a baby. There was a note, a simple note, saying to take care of me. And that's all? Thomas pressed, his voice urgent. Victoria Nari. They didn't know anything else. They raised me as their own, but they died when I was young. I've always wondered about my real parents. Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. I think I know who you are, Victoria, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I think you're the Queen's child. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Queen's child? It was preposterous, unbelievable. And yet, deep down, a sliver of recognition, a sense of inevitability, flickered within her. But how? She whispered, her voice hoarse with disbelief. Your father, Amelia explained, glancing towards the door of her hidden room as though her father would suddenly appear. He was entrusted with arranging everything. The secret marriage, the birth, the adoption, he orchestrated it all, to protect the Queen, to protect the monarchy. And Albert, he found out? Thomas asked, his voice grim. Amelia nodded. He stumbled upon the truth, somehow, she said. He discovered the connection between the Queen, Lord Ashworth, and you, Victoria. That's why he wrote the letter, Victoria said, her mind racing. That's why he warned me about his family, about Edward. He knew I was in danger. Edward wants the throne, Thomas said, his voice low. He wants to use you, to control the Queen, to seize power for himself and the Order. But if I'm the Queen's child, Victoria said, her voice trembling, then I'm the rightful heir. Amelia nodded. You are, she said. And that's why Edward is so dangerous. He'll stop at nothing to eliminate you, to silence you, to prevent you from claiming your birthright. The weight of the revelation, the enormity of the danger, pressed down on Victoria. She felt overwhelmed, terrified, but also strangely empowered. She was not just a grieving widow, a nurse, a woman caught in a web of intrigue. She was a princess, a rightful heir to the throne. We need to get you to safety, Thomas said, his voice urgent. We need to get you out of here, away from Edward, away from the Order. But where? Victoria asked, her voice filled with despair. Where can we go? Who can we trust? Amelia hesitated, her gaze thoughtful. There is one place, she said. One person who might be able to help us. Someone who is beyond Edward's reach. Someone who has a personal stake in this. Who? Victoria and Thomas asked in unison. Amelia looked directly at Victoria. There was a long, heartbreaking pause. Your father, Amelia stated. The man the Queen secretly married. He is still alive. He is the only one who knows the entire truth, and he is the only one powerful enough, outside of the monarchy, to stand against Edward and the Order. The serpent's coil was tightening, but now, there might be a way to break free. The truth, however, was about to become far more complicated. Chapter 15. Scars of Remembrance. The revelation that Victoria's father was still alive and that he held the key to defeating Edward and the Order of the Raven sent a wave of conflicting emotions through her. Hope, fear, disbelief, and a profound sense of longing warred within her. The idea that her father, a man she had never known, a man shrouded in secrecy and mystery, might be her salvation was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Where is he?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "How do we find him?" Amelia hesitated, her gaze flickering nervously towards the door of her hidden room.
"It's complicated," she said.
"He's been living in hiding, under an assumed identity, for years. To protect himself, to protect you. But you know where he is?" Thomas pressed, his voice urgent. Amelia nodded. "I do," she said. "But it's not safe to talk about it here. Edward has spies everywhere, even within these walls. We need to get out of here first."
"How?"
Victoria asked. "The manor is surrounded. Edward's men are surely watching every exit. There's a secret passage," Amelia said. "It leads from the old cellars to the woods beyond the estate. It's dangerous, and it hasn't been used in years, but it's our only hope." "Then let's go," Thomas said, his voice decisive. "We don't have time to waste." Amelia led them through another hidden door, concealed behind a bookshelf in her room. This passage was even narrower and darker than the previous one, the air thick with a scent of dust and damp earth. It felt as if they were descending into the very bowels of the earth, into a forgotten world of secrets and shadows. They made their way through the twisting passage, their footsteps echoing softly in the silence. The only light came from Thomas's lantern, the flickering flame casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Victoria felt a sense of claustrophobia, a feeling of being trapped, of being buried alive. As they walked, Amelia began to tell Victoria about her father, about the man he was, the life he had led. She spoke of his kindness, his intelligence, his unwavering sense of duty and honor. She spoke of his love for the Queen, a love that had been forbidden, a love that had cost him everything. "He never stopped loving her," Amelia said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. "And he never stopped loving you, Victoria. Even though he couldn't be with you, he always watched over you from afar." Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. The thought of her father, this unknown man who had loved her from a distance, who had sacrificed his own happiness for her safety, filled her with a profound sense of longing, a yearning for a connection she had never known. "He's a good man, Victoria," Amelia said. "A brave man. He's the only one who can help us now." They reached the end of the passage, a heavy wooden door, bolted and barred. Thomas struggled with the bolts, his muscles straining with the effort. Finally, with a loud creak, the door swung open, revealing a dark, damp cellar. The cellar was filled with cobwebs and dust, the air thick with a scent of mildew and decay. Old wine barrels lay scattered around, their contents long since evaporated. Rats scurried in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. "This way," Amelia said, leading them through the cellar, towards another hidden door, concealed behind a stack of empty crates. They were almost there, almost free. But just as they reached the door, a voice echoed through the cellar. "Going somewhere?" They froze, their hearts leaping into their throats. They turned to see Edward Ashworth standing at the entrance to the cellar, a sneer on his face, a pistol in his hand. He was flanked by two burly men, their faces grim, their hands resting on the weapons at their belts. "Hello, cousin," Edward said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Fancy meeting you here." He looked at Victoria, his eyes filled with a mixture of malice and triumph. "And you," he said. "The little lost princess. I've been looking for you." Victoria felt a surge of fear, but also a surge of defiance. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting Edward's gaze without flinching. "You won't get away with this, Edward," she said, her voice firm. "Your reign of terror is over." Edward laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the cellar. "You think so?" he said. "You think you can stop me? You're just a pawn, a tool to be used. Just like your mother." He raised his pistol, pointing it directly at Victoria. "It's time to end this charade," he said. "It's time for the rightful heir to claim his throne." Thomas stepped in front of Victoria, shielding her with his body. "Don't do it, Edward," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll have to go through me first." Edward merely grinned. "Gladly." A tense standoff ensued, a tableau of violence and desperation. The scars of remembrance, both old and new, were about to be reopened. Chapter 16. The Unveiling. The silence in the cellar was thick with tension, the air heavy with the threat of violence. Edward's sneer, Thomas's protective stance, Victoria's defiant gaze, Amelia's fear-stricken face. It was a tableau of impending conflict, a clash between good and evil, between love and hate, between the past and the future. Before anyone could move, before a shot could be fired, another voice echoed through the cellar, a voice that was both familiar and unexpected. "Edward, put down the gun." Everyone turned towards the source of the voice. Standing at the entrance to the cellar, silhouetted against the dim light of the passageway, was Lord Ashworth. He was holding a shotgun, his hands steady, his gaze fixed on his nephew with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Edward's eyes widened in surprise, his sneer faltering slightly. "Uncle?" he said, his voice incredulous. What are you doing here?" "I'm stopping you, Edward," Lord Ashworth replied, his voice firm. "I'm putting an end to your madness." "You're supposed to be gone," Edward stammered. "I made sure of it." "You underestimated me, Edward," Lord Ashworth said. "You underestimated your own family. You always have." He took a step forward, his shotgun leveled at Edward. "Put down the gun, Edward," he repeated. "It's over." Edward hesitated, his gaze flickering between his uncle and Victoria. He was clearly caught off guard, his carefully laid plans unraveling before his eyes. "Don't be a fool, Uncle," he said, his voice regaining some of its confidence. "You can't stop me. I have the power now. I have the order behind me." "The order is nothing but a pack of wolves," Lord Ashworth retorted. "And you, Edward, are their lapdog. You're a disgrace to the Ashworth name." He took another step forward, his shotgun unwavering. "Put down the gun, Edward," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "Or I swear, I will shoot you where you stand." Edward's hand trembled slightly, his grip on the pistol loosening. He looked at his uncle, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. He knew that his uncle was not bluffing. He knew that he was cornered. You wouldn't," he stammered. "You wouldn't kill your own nephew. You ceased to be my nephew the moment you betrayed your family, your country, and your own soul," Lord Ashworth replied. "You are a monster, Edward, and monsters must be stopped." He cocked the shotgun, the metallic click echoing through the cellar, a sound that sealed Edward's fate. Edward, realizing that he was defeated, slowly lowered his pistol, his shoulders slumping in resignation. His two henchmen, seeing their leaders surrender, followed suit, dropping their weapons to the ground. "It's over, Edward," Lord Ashworth said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's finally over." He turned to Victoria, his gaze softening. "Are you all right, my dear?" he asked. Victoria nodded, her body still trembling from the confrontation, but her spirit unbroken. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thank you." Lord Ashworth looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas," he said, "for protecting her, for bringing her here." Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "It was Albert's wish," he said. "I owed it to him." Lord Ashworth then turned to Amelia, his hidden daughter, his eyes filled with love and remorse. "Amelia," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "My dear, sweet Amelia."
"I'm so sorry. For everything."
Amelia ran to her father, embracing him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Father," she whispered. "Oh, Father, I thought I'd lost you." The scene was one of both relief and sorrow, a moment of catharsis after years of secrets, lies, and fear. The unveiling was complete. The truth, however painful, had been revealed. The Order of the Raven, Edward's reign of terror, had been brought to an end. But the journey was not over. There was still the matter of Victoria's true identity, of her claim to the throne, of her father, the man who had been living in hiding, waiting for this moment. The final chapter of this long and winding saga was yet to be written. The immediate danger, though, had passed. Lord Ashworth looked at them all, a tired but relieved look on his face. "We need to leave.
Now."
Chapter 17. Beyond the Trenches. With Edward and his henchmen disarmed and subdued, Lord Ashworth led the group out of the cellar and through the secret passage, back into the overgrown gardens of Ashworth Manor. The storm that had been brewing earlier had finally broken, a torrential downpour lashing the grounds, mirroring the emotional tempest that had raged within the manor's walls. They made their way through the darkness, their clothes soaked, their bodies chilled, but their spirits buoyed by a sense of relief, of victory, of a new beginning. They had escaped Edward's clutches, they had uncovered the secrets of the Order of the Raven, and they were now on their way to find Victoria's father, the man who held the key to her future, to the future of the country. As they reached the edge of the estate, where Thomas had hidden the motor car, Lord Ashworth stopped. "We'll need to split up," he said, his voice low. "It's too risky to travel together. Edward's allies will be looking for us." He turned to Thomas. "Thomas, you take Amelia and get her to safety," he said. "Take her to my friend in Scotland, the one I told you about. He'll protect her." Thomas nodded, his expression grim.
"And you?"
he asked. "I'll take Victoria to her father," Lord Ashworth replied. "It's time she knew the truth. It's time she met the man who has loved her from afar for all these years." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. She was about to meet her father, the man she had never known, the man who had been forced to give her up, to live a life of secrecy and exile. She felt a mixture of anticipation, excitement, and trepidation. She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, "for everything, for protecting me, for believing in me, for helping me find my way." Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "It was my honor, Victoria," he said. "You're a remarkable woman. Albert would be proud of you." He turned to Amelia, his expression softening. "Take care of yourself, Amelia," he said. "And don't worry, I'll get you to safety." Amelia nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, "for everything." They embraced, a brief but heartfelt farewell, before Thomas and Amelia disappeared into the darkness, heading towards their own uncertain future. Victoria and Lord Ashworth climbed into the motor car, the engine sputtering to life, a beacon of hope in the stormy night. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the wipers against the windshield, the steady hum of the engine. Victoria looked at Lord Ashworth, at his weathered face, his tired eyes, his expression a mixture of determination and sorrow. She felt a surge of gratitude for this man, this unlikely ally, who had risked his own life to protect her, to help her uncover the truth. "Thank you, Lord Ashworth," she said, her voice sincere, "for everything you've done, for saving me, for trusting me, for leading me to my father." Lord Ashworth smiled, a faint, weary smile. "It was my duty, my dear," he said, "and it was my pleasure. You remind me so much of your mother. Strong, courageous, determined." He paused, his gaze shifting to the road ahead. "Your father, he's a good man, Victoria," he said. "A brave man. He's been waiting for this day for a long time." What is he like?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Lord Ashworth hesitated, his expression thoughtful.
"He's different," he said.
"He's had to live a life of disguise, of deception. He's had to suppress his true identity, his true feelings. But beneath it all, he's still the same man. The man who loved your mother, the man who would do anything for his daughter." They continued to drive, the miles stretching before them, the landscape a blur of darkness and rain. Victoria's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She was about to meet her father, the man who had shaped her destiny, the man who held the key to her future. As they approached their destination, a small, secluded cottage nestled in the heart of the Yorkshire countryside, Victoria felt a knot of anticipation tightening in her stomach. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, all her life. This was where the past and present were about to meet. The trenches of war and deceit were finally behind her. Lord Ashworth parked outside the cottage, which had a dim light coming from a downstairs window. "Wait here a moment," he said, getting out of the car and looking around. It was still raining. Victoria watched as he cautiously approached the front door. Everything felt quiet, but the sense of foreboding had not truly left her. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. Victoria watched through the rain-streaked window of the motor car as Lord Ashworth approached the cottage. He knocked softly on the door, waited a moment, then knocked again, a little louder this time. The dim light inside flickered, and then the door opened slowly, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. Victoria couldn't see the man clearly, but she could sense the tension, the apprehension in Lord Ashworth's posture. They spoke in hushed tones for a few moments, their words lost in the sound of the wind and the rain. Then, Lord Ashworth turned and beckoned to Victoria. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and stepped out of the car. The cold rain washed over her, a shock to her system, but she barely noticed it. Her gaze was fixed on the cottage, on the figure standing in the doorway, on the man who was about to change her life forever. As she approached the cottage, the man stepped out of the shadows, and Victoria saw him for the first time. He was tall and slender, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, the same eyes she had seen in Thomas, the same eyes that had stared back at her from the mirror all her life. He was wearing a simple tweed jacket and trousers, his clothes worn but clean, his demeanor radiating a quiet strength, a gentle dignity. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching, his eyes filling with a mixture of recognition, wonder, and a profound, overwhelming love. He didn't speak, he couldn't speak. He simply opened his arms, a silent invitation, a gesture of acceptance, of belonging. Victoria ran to him, her heart overflowing with emotion, and embraced him tightly. She felt his arms close around her, strong and protective, and she finally knew, that she was home. She was with her father. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, his tears mingling with the rain on her face. "My beloved daughter." They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other. The years of separation, of secrecy, of longing, melting away in the warmth of their embrace. The world outside, the storm, the danger, the conspiracy, faded into insignificance. All that mattered was this moment, this reunion, this connection that had been denied to them for so long. Lord Ashworth stood nearby, watching them, his own eyes filled with tears. He had brought them together. He had fulfilled his promise. He had righted a wrong that had been committed so many years ago. Finally, Victoria's father pulled back slightly, his gaze searching her face, his hands cupping her cheeks. "Let me look at you," he said, his voice trembling. "Let me see the woman you've become." He studied her, his eyes tracing every feature, every line, every expression. He saw the strength, the courage, the determination that had brought her through so much. He saw the resemblance to her mother, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. "You're so beautiful," he whispered. "So like your mother." He smiled, a bittersweet smile that spoke of both joy and sorrow, of love and loss. "I'm so proud of you, Victoria," he said. "So proud of the woman you've become." They went inside the cottage, a small, cozy space filled with warmth and light. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and freshly brewed tea. They sat together, by the fire, and talked for hours. Victoria's father, whose name was revealed to be Arthur, told her the story of his life, of his secret marriage to the Queen, of his forced exile, of his unwavering love for her mother. He told her about the Order of the Raven, about their origins, their goals, their methods. He told her about Edward's ambition, his ruthlessness, his determination to seize power, to control the throne. Victoria, in turn, told him about Albert, about his bravery, his sacrifice, about the secrets he had uncovered, about the danger she had faced. She told him about Thomas, about Amelia, about Lord Ashworth, about their journey to find him. They talked until the early hours of the morning, sharing their stories, their fears, their hopes. They were no longer strangers, separated by years of secrecy and lies. They were father and daughter, bound by blood, by love, by a shared destiny. As the dawn broke, casting a pale light through the windows of the cottage, Victoria knew that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just Victoria Bennet, the grieving widow, the nurse, the woman caught in a web of intrigue. She was Victoria, the daughter of a king, the rightful heir to the throne, a woman with a purpose, a destiny to fulfill. The heart's reckoning had been painful, a journey through darkness and despair. But it had also been a journey of discovery, of self-realization, of love and belonging. She had found her father, she had found her true identity, and she had found the strength within herself to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Arthur looked at his daughter, with deep love. "What will you do now?" he asked. Victoria didn't hesitate. Chapter 19. A Glimmer of Dawn. Victoria looked at her father, Arthur, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and concern. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication, a decision that would shape not only their lives, but the future of the country. "What will you do now?" he had asked. She didn't hesitate. "I will reclaim my birthright," she said, her voice firm, her gaze steady. "I will expose Edward and the Order of the Raven. I will take my rightful place on the throne and bring justice to those who have suffered under their reign of terror." Arthur smiled, a proud, loving smile.
"I knew you would," he said.
"You have your mother's spirit, her courage, her determination." He paused, his expression turning serious. "But it won't be easy, Victoria," he said. "The Order is powerful, entrenched. They have allies in high places, even within the royal family." "I know," Victoria replied, "but I'm not afraid. I have you, I have Lord Ashworth, and I have the truth on my side." "And you have the people," Arthur added. "The people are weary of war, of corruption, of injustice. They yearn for a leader who will bring peace, prosperity, and hope." They discussed their strategy, their plan of action. They would need to gather evidence, to build a case against Edward and the Order, to expose their crimes to the world. They would need to find allies, people they could trust, people who would stand with them against the forces of darkness. They would need to confront the Queen, to reveal the truth about Victoria's birth, to challenge her complicity with Edward and the Order. It would be a difficult, painful confrontation, a clash between mother and daughter, between duty and love, between the past and the future. But Victoria was ready. She had come too far, she had endured too much, to turn back now. She had found her father, she had discovered her true identity, and she had embraced her destiny. As the sun rose, casting a golden glow over the Yorkshire countryside, Victoria and Arthur left the cottage, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They were embarking on a perilous journey, a battle against a powerful and ruthless enemy. But they were not alone. They had each other, and they had the truth on their side. They traveled to London, to a safe house provided by Lord Ashworth, a place where they could plan their next move, gather their allies, and prepare for the final confrontation. The city was still recovering from the ravages of war, the scars of conflict visible everywhere. But there was also a sense of renewal, a sense of hope, a glimmer of dawn after years of darkness. Victoria and Arthur began to work tirelessly, gathering evidence, contacting potential allies, building a network of support. They reached out to Inspector Davies, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy, the truth about Victoria's birth, the Queen's complicity. Davies, initially shocked and skeptical, was eventually convinced by the overwhelming evidence, by Victoria's unwavering determination, by Arthur's quiet authority. He pledged his support, promising to use his position within Scotland Yard to expose Edward and the Order, to bring them to justice. They also reached out to other influential figures, people in government, in the military, in society, people who had been disillusioned by the corruption, the injustice, the tyranny of the Order. They found allies in unexpected places, People who were willing to risk everything to fight for a better future. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The final confrontation was drawing near. Victoria knew that it would be a dangerous, difficult battle, a clash between light and darkness, between good and evil. But she was ready. She had found her strength, her courage, her purpose. She was no longer just Victoria Bennet. She was Victoria, the rightful heir to the throne, a woman who would fight for her people, for her country, for her future. The glimmer of dawn was growing brighter. The promise of a new day, a new era, was within reach. The weight of the past, the burden of secrets, was lifting, replaced by a sense of hope, of determination, of a future filled with possibilities. She looked out of the window, onto the bustling streets. The sun, for the first time in a long time, shone brightly. She knew one thing for sure. She would not fail. Chapter 20. The Light of Absolution. The day of the confrontation arrived, a day of reckoning, a day of truth. Victoria, Arthur, and Lord Ashworth, along with Inspector Davies and a small group of trusted allies, gathered at Buckingham Palace, the heart of the monarchy, the seat of power. They were there to confront the Queen, to expose Edward and the Order of the Raven, to claim Victoria's rightful place on the throne. The atmosphere in the palace was tense, electric. The Queen's guards, unaware of the true purpose of their visit, eyed them with suspicion. The courtiers, sensing the undercurrent of conflict, whispered amongst themselves, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Victoria, dressed in a simple but elegant gown, stood tall and proud, her head held high, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. She was about to face her mother, the woman who had given her up, the woman who had been complicit in Edward's crimes. It would be a painful, difficult confrontation, but it was necessary. The truth had to be revealed. Justice had to be served. They were ushered into the Queen's private audience chamber, a grand, opulent room filled with priceless works of art, antique furniture, and the weight of centuries of history. The Queen, seated on a gilded throne, looked regal and imposing, her face a mask of composure, her eyes betraying a flicker of fear, of guilt. Edward, standing beside her, smirked at Victoria, his eyes filled with malice and contempt. He clearly believed he was in control, that he had the upper hand. He had no idea that his world was about to come crashing down around him. "Your Majesty," Lord Ashworth said, stepping forward, his voice respectful but firm. "We are here today to present you with evidence of a grave conspiracy, a plot to undermine the monarchy, to seize power for a corrupt and ruthless organization known as the Order of the Raven." The Queen's face remained impassive, but her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly. "I am aware of no such conspiracy," she said, her voice cold and distant. "With all due respect, Your Majesty," Inspector Davies interjected, "we have overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Evidence that implicates your nephew, Edward Ashworth, and others, in a plot to overthrow the rightful heir to the throne." He paused, his gaze shifting to Victoria. "Evidence that reveals the true identity of your daughter, Princess Victoria." The Queen gasped, her composure finally cracking. She looked at Victoria, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a flicker of recognition. My daughter?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, Your Majesty," Arthur said, stepping forward, his voice filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Our daughter. The child you were forced to give up, the child you have mourned in secret, all these years." He looked at Victoria, his eyes filled with pride. "Victoria," he said, "is the rightful heir to the throne, and she is here to claim her birthright." The Queen stared at Victoria, her gaze searching, questioning. She saw the resemblance to herself, to Arthur, the man she had loved, the man she had been forced to betray. She saw the strength, the courage, the determination in her daughter's eyes, the same qualities that had defined her own reign. Tears welled up in the Queen's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. The weight of her past, the burden of her secrets, finally broke her. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. My beloved daughter. She rose from her throne, her legs trembling, and embraced Victoria, holding her tightly, as if she would never let her go. It was a moment of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of a love that had endured through years of separation and secrecy. Edward, seeing his plans unraveling, his power slipping away, lunged at Victoria, his face contorted with rage. "You'll never take the throne," he screamed. "I'll kill you first." But before he could reach her, Inspector Davies and his men intervened, tackling him to the ground, restraining him. His reign of terror was finally over. The Queen, released from Edward's grip, from the shackles of her past, turned to her court, to her people. "I have a confession to make," she said, her voice strong and clear. "A truth that has been hidden for too long." She told them everything. She told them about her secret marriage to Arthur, about the birth of her daughter, about the Order of the Raven, about Edward's plot to seize power. She told them about her own complicity, her own mistakes, her own regrets. It was a moment of catharsis, of absolution, of a new beginning. The truth had been revealed. Justice had been served. The light of dawn had finally broken through the darkness. Victoria, standing beside her mother, her father by her side, felt a sense of peace, of fulfillment, of a destiny realized. She had found her family, she had claimed her birthright, and she had brought hope to a nation weary of war and corruption. The assembled crowd were in shock, but there was a sense of release, too. The Queen looked at her daughter, a profound and deep love radiating. "The throne is yours, my child. Take it with my blessing." It was done. Victoria turned to everyone gathered and addressed them, for the first time, as their rightful heir. "My first act as your future queen will be to ensure truth always prevails." The light of absolution shone brightly. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of renewal. Victoria, guided by her father, Arthur, and supported by Lord Ashworth and a council of trusted advisors, set about reforming the monarchy, dismantling the Order of the Raven, and bringing justice to those who had suffered under their rule. Edward Ashworth was tried and convicted of treason, his crimes exposed to the world. The members of the Order, their secrets revealed, their power broken, were hunted down and brought to justice. The country, weary of war and corruption, embraced their new queen, a woman of strength, courage, and compassion. Victoria proved to be a wise and just ruler, a leader who put the needs of her people first. She implemented reforms that improved the lives of ordinary citizens, promoted education, healthcare, and social justice. She fostered a spirit of unity, of cooperation, of reconciliation, healing the wounds of the past, building a brighter future. She never forgot Albert, the man she had loved, the man who had sacrificed his life to uncover the truth. She established a foundation in his name, dedicated to supporting veterans and their families, to honoring the memory of those who had fallen in the war. Thomas, true to his word, ensured Amelia's safety, helping her to build a new life, far from the shadows of Ashworth Manor. They remained close friends, their bond forged in the crucible of danger and shared loss. Amelia, free from the confines of her hidden existence, blossomed into a strong, independent woman, using her experiences to help others who had suffered from trauma and abuse. Victoria and Arthur, reunited after years of separation, built a strong and loving relationship. They spent countless hours together, sharing stories, memories, and dreams. They found solace in each other's company, healing the wounds of the past, forging a bond that would never be broken. The Queen, relieved of the burden of her secrets, found peace in her retirement. She watched with pride as her daughter, Victoria, ruled with wisdom and compassion, fulfilling the destiny that had been denied to her. The country prospered under Victoria's reign. The scars of war slowly healed, replaced by a sense of hope, of optimism, of a future filled with possibilities. The light of absolution, the promise of a new dawn, had finally broken through the darkness. One quiet afternoon, many years later, Victoria found herself standing in Abney Park Cemetery before Albert's grave. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. But this time, there were no chilling confessions, no echoes of a troubled past. There was only peace, a sense of closure, a quiet understanding. She knelt before the grave, tracing the letters of his name, her fingers lingering on the inscription, "Beloved son." Faithful soldier. Beloved. Yes, he had been that. Faithful. Absolutely. She smiled, a bittersweet smile that spoke of both love and loss, of gratitude and remembrance. She had kept her promise. She had uncovered the truth. She had avenged his death, and she had built a better world, a world worthy of his sacrifice. "I never truly left," he had whispered, on that fateful night, so long ago. And in a way, he hadn't. He lived on in her heart, in her memory, in the legacy of justice and hope that she had created. He lived on in the spirit of a nation renewed, a nation healed, a nation finally at peace. She stood up, her gaze sweeping over the quiet cemetery, the ancient yew trees, the weathered tombstones. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, a promise of a new day, a new beginning. She turned and walked away, leaving the shadows behind, stepping into the light. Her journey had been long and arduous, a path filled with danger, loss, and heartbreak. But it had also been a journey of discovery, of self-realization, of love and redemption. She had found her family, her purpose, her destiny. She had become the woman she was always meant to be. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was ready for whatever the future held. The whispers were gone now. Only peace remained. A deep, enduring, and hard-won peace. The end.